some principles stay the same. Like even in traditional finance, the criminals are always a step ahead of tools, and you need to constantly innovate. In crypto, I'd say that speed is like, the speed of innovation is much faster. So what changes in months in traditional finance changes in probably weeks in crypto. So making sure you're abreast of all the new phenomenon that's happening, what criminals are doing to essentially avoid all kinds of regulatory red tape, and then making sure that our compliance solutions can adapt to that. That's a big theme for us in risk monitoring.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's podcast, we have Mriganka Pattnaik, co-founder and CEO of Merkle Science. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do company snapshots with interesting founders from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Mriganka from Merkle Science. All right. Today we have Mriganka Pattnaik, co-founder and CEO at Merkle Science. Really excited to chat. How are you doing, Mriganka?
Hi, Tanner. I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. So maybe to start, I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your story. If you could talk about kind of how you got to what you're working on now, I think that'd be a really interesting place to start.
Sure. So in terms of my background, I'd spent a couple of years in investment banking, realized that was very boring, and then moved over to tech startups. That was at Bank of America. And my crypto journey began at a crypto exchange called Luno. So I was working for them in Singapore, helping them expand across Southeast Asia. That was quite exciting. This was crypto back in 2015, so it was still pretty niche, close-knit community, just as exciting as today, where there'd still be like price spikes and crashes and scams and everything else. One thing that caught my attention was that there were a lot of crypto scams. As we were expanding from 5 to 40 countries, it was just obvious. Every single country, the biggest problem we'd have was scams, hacks, security concerns, and last but not the least, regulatory clarity. So back then, there weren't clear guidelines for crypto exchanges. So regulators would be wary of the industry as a whole. And the number one question was always, what are you doing to make sure criminals don't use your platform? Yep. And that was my inspiration for starting the company. I felt that when we started late in 2018, it was clear that this was a need, making sure that criminals don't enter these crypto platforms. But I could also see that crypto was just going to pour into other segments like e-commerce. Financial institutions will start using them in the future. So that was the signal. I met my co-founder at an incubator called Entrepreneur First. So he had worked at PayPal. He's the CTO. He'd worked at PayPal as a fraud data scientist. A little cliche, but it was like love at first sight. And where both of us really liked the idea and thought it had a lot of potential. Yeah. And since then, we've been going along the journey. We just closed a Series A round. Of course, the industry's changed, but things are just as exciting, if not more. Yeah, that's a little bit about the story of how we started.
Definitely. That's great. So for the listeners, what is Merkle Science? What do you guys do?
Sure. We provide a predictive blockchain risk monitoring solution. So this helps crypto companies and financial institutions with their crypto compliance, essentially helps them make sure that criminals don't send them Bitcoin. It helps government agencies and law enforcement track stolen cryptocurrencies. So whenever there's a hack or a scam, they use our forensics tool to track where those funds are going to and essentially use that data to capture the criminal.
Super interesting. So I find this really interesting for a couple of reasons, but I think one interesting angle is that, going back even almost 10 years, right? The original product market fit for crypto kind of wasn't the most socially great, right? It was kind of like Silk Road, that kind of stuff. And I guess I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about the evolution of kind of crypto risk and how it's been thought about as things have evolved over the last 10 years or so, where there's just it's a totally different world. And I'm just curious kind of from your vantage point on that.
Sure. So I think around the time we started, the US had the Bank Secrecy Act, so somewhat of like in terms of clear regulation, like they clarified that you should definitely like make sure Bitcoin doesn't come from criminals. There were some licenses that were given out to crypto companies back then. But most other geographies like the UK, Europe, as well as most parts of Asia, didn't have a licensing regime. So crypto risk was very niche. Only the best players, the largest or the most compliant players, ended up getting tools such as ours to make sure criminals don't use them. The last 2 or 3 years, what we saw happening was that every major geography now has a crypto licensing regime. Either that or they've published AML guidelines. So essentially, it's become a must have instead of a good to have. Mm-hmm. And then I think less than a month ago, the US Treasury also sanctioned Tornado Cash. So even now we were seeing that like gaming companies would avoid compliance solutions, like it'll be financial institutions, crypto exchanges would be the early adopters. But with the Tornado Cash sanction, I think even like play to earn, gaming, all these segments essentially now require compliance and it's mandatory. Otherwise, they will get arrested. Or it was always compulsory, but not as clear. It just becomes clearer and clearer to the industry. So we're seeing it become a category of its own and go mainstream now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious what kind of unique challenges exist for kind of compliance and risk intelligence in Web3 that just kind of flat out don't exist in Web2. You know, it's building this new financial system, but I'm curious what are some of these unique challenges that's different.
Sure, I think some principles stay the same. Like even in traditional finance, the criminals are always a step ahead of tools, and you need to constantly innovate. In crypto, I'd say that speed is like, the speed of innovation is much faster. So what changes in months in traditional finance changes in probably weeks in crypto. So making sure you're abreast of all the new phenomenon that's happening, what criminals are doing to essentially avoid all kinds of regulatory red tape, and then making sure that our compliance solutions can adapt to that. That's a big theme for us in risk monitoring. That's one thing that's different. Apart from that, I think just like the surface area is a lot larger. There's just so many new things, so many new complex items that come up that you need to constantly keep stay aware of the entire breadth of the industry if you're to make the risk monitoring solution better and better.
Yeah, it seems extremely complex, right? There's just so many different projects from small to large, right? Like how do you go about keeping track of what's going on and iterating and learning to keep delivering for your clients?
Sure. So I think hiring the right team for this is essential. They need to love crypto and love to explore, love to learn. And second, I think like we've got this unique part of our technology, which is not like all the other companies in our space, they use databases, but we have a more predictive component to our tech where we look at just wallet addresses and behavior. So that helps us evolve a lot faster, right? Irrespective of the technology, if the wallet is behaving suspiciously or has a particular pattern that's similar to criminal activity, then we can detect that and flag it out to our customers.
Yeah, love it. Maybe talk about those customers you're working with. Like, what are people finding most interesting with your work? Are there any common attributes that are common traits between the folks that are finding you or you're finding them?
Sure. So I think it's a combination of both. As we grow as a company, as the industry matures, we definitely see more of people finding us. And it's the same across. One thing we have noticed is no matter what people do to detect crypto crime, more than like 50% or 60% of crypto crime goes undetected.
Hmm.
So our customers are also well aware of that. I mean, they understand that this is something like a seat belt. Seat belt doesn't necessarily prevent you from injuries in a crash, but gives you like a higher probability of not getting hurt.
Sure.
So I think that's been happening throughout. What we've seen change is the maturity of the industry. I think earlier the questions we'd get were, "What do you do? Why is this relevant to me?" And now most people come after they've gone through an incident or are applying for a license,
Mm-hmm.
and they just want to know the technical details more. It's just evolved a lot more now and gone mainstream.
Yeah. I'm curious, what does the world you're kind of building look like in 5 years if everything goes as planned, right? Like you already kind of touched on this evolution in the industry as a whole, where it's gone from a kind of nice to have or kind of a nudge to go in a more compliant direction to a no, it's actually a need to have, and you'll get in a lot of trouble if you don't take these things seriously. So I'm curious, where are we going? Like 5 years from now, what will things look like?
Sure. So, one thing I can see very clearly happening is crypto is going mainstream. Now, while financial institutions adopting crypto is a lot more in the limelight, everyone's aware of that. There's all types of companies, e-commerce, payment processors, even retailers who are adopting it for like NFT usage. So you're going to see just more and more of just Web3 going mainstream. And our vision or our mission has always been to make crypto safe, or provide the infrastructure to build the next generation of financial products or next generation of cutting edge products. So crypto compliance will become more important as well. So um, during this crash, one thing that everyone's expecting is that now that BlockFi had an incident, Celsius had an incident, and so did Three Arrows. I mean, one thing that was common across all these three companies was bad governance
Mm-hmm.
and lack of regulatory oversight. Or so there will be a recoil effect where now regulators come back and say, "Okay, we've let innovation go too far. It's hurting consumers." So there will be
Mm-hmm.
over regulation, and I think that crypto is basically going to mature, grow up, and it's no longer going to be two or three people starting a tech startup. You'll see more mature founders, like potentially with financial services experience or scaling experience, coming in and doing things in a safer manner, right? So growth at all costs is not going to be the focus. There's going to be a lot more focus on security,
Mm-hmm.
compliance, and just safety of consumers as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious your take on kind of KYC, know your client. It's a little controversial for some in Web3 historically, right? As it's kind of part of these bigger conversations around identity and risk. Uh, it sounds like, I mean, if I had to guess, I think it sounds like you're on the side of, I think, uh, more regulation can really help consumers, help investors in a way that, I'm sure you have a nuanced perspective on this, and I'd love to hear more about uh, how you view some of these changes.
Sure. So that is obviously a very controversial topic. A lot of crypto OGs tend to view us as anti-crypto, but that's not the point at all. What we want is more adoption of crypto for it to go mainstream. And the only practical, real-world way that can happen is if there are some controls, right? Regulators can understand what's happening. And even just the original concept of crypto, that there should just be more transparency. So that's what Merkle's aim is, where we're just providing more transparency, reducing complexity so that you can understand what's actually happening, where the money is coming from. And we're all for privacy, but it shouldn't come at the cost of promoting criminals, right? So
Of
if
course.
it's something like ransomware, child pornography, then we're definitely against those things. We're definitely against criminal activity. And we try and focus on those areas primarily.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting point where I do suspect that some of these conversations get wrapped up in ideology when there's actually really bad stuff that could be happening that you're really on the front lines of protecting against, right? I think it's a really valid point that, you know, there's real things, there's real maybe trade-offs, but there's also real things that protection is worth having for. So I think that's really interesting. Do you have any advice for founders, other founders building in the Web3 space? Our listeners are mostly kind of, building in Web3. And I'm just curious for founders and builders, what you'd have to say based on your prior experience and also kind of your current experience with Merkle Science.
Sure. So I think my number one advice is don't get carried away by the hype. Like in a bull market, there's all kinds of bad projects that are hyped up. So don't follow that, right? And in a bear market, there's a lot of negative sentiment. So don't get scared by that. Essentially, try and build things for the long term, right? Short term ups and downs are difficult to predict, but whether something will be of a lot of use long term is a lot easier. So just focus on that as you start a company now or as you're growing a company now. And whatever's happening in the market right now is just a mere correction. As long as you build a sustainable company that has long term value, I'm sure you'll find your way.
Yeah, definitely. So what are you guys working on now, and what's the best way for people to kind of follow along your journey?
Sure. So we have a blog on our website. I think that's where we stay up to date on everything that's happening in crypto compliance, crypto regulation, and we post our findings there. That would be the best way to follow Merkle, and our LinkedIn and Twitter channels. In terms of what we're working on right now, I think clearly Tornado Cash, so the US Treasury sanctioned Tornado Cash. So that's a major focus for us right now. And DeFi, NFTs, bridges, these are all areas that are vulnerable now or require a lot more compliance tools. So that's going to be another area of focus for us as we're growing. And then in general, creating the best in class cutting edge tools that can help customers predict criminal activity. A lot of compliance or even forensics right now is done retrospectively. So after a crime happens, you try and keep a criminal out. But we're trying to focus on technology that can look at behavioral patterns and detect criminal activity before it happens, right? So that's another major focus for us right now.
Very cool. Well, Mriganka, thank you so much for your time. Love chatting with you. For anyone that wants to learn a little bit more about Merkle Science, it's www.merklescience.com. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Tanner, for having me. It was great chatting.
All right. Take care.